Hello, my name is Joshua Keith, and this is theburningcoal.com, a website dedicated to God's glory, His grace, and our response to it. Today, we're going to continue our conversations about evidences, and I have Mr. Tim Boaz here with us again. Hey, Tim, how's it going?
Hey, Josh. It's pretty good. How about you?
Doing good, doing good. I'm excited to get into this one. This is something that
Oh,
we've
me
been
too.
talking about. Yeah, and I've been studying up on, and I'm really excited to be talking about it. And what we're going to be talking about today is the cosmological argument. This really starts a series of a few different arguments talking about the beginning of the universe, talking about a creator of the universe, and whether or not that's something that we have good evidence to believe in. Now, a big part of these arguments that we're going to be taking a look at is the idea of deductive reasoning. And I think it's important for us to take a step back and talk a second about deductive reasoning because it's something we use all the time and we may not even recognize when we use it. But it's very important in understanding of logic and again trying to prove something. We want to prove a conclusion. And so a good example that I've read about deductive reasoning is if it's raining outside, there are going to be clouds in the sky. And so we understand this about science. We know that if it's raining, there are clouds in the sky. So if I take a look out of my window right here and I see it raining, even though I can't see the sky because of the angle of my window, I know I can conclude that there are clouds in the sky. And so what we do there is we take a couple of different premises. The premise one being that when it's raining, there are clouds. Premise two being that it's raining right now. And then from that, we can draw a conclusion that there are, in fact, clouds in the sky. So again, this is something that we do all the time. We use it quite a bit, but I think it really helps to crystallize our thought processes and our arguments whenever we take a look at it specifically like this. However, Tim, you and I have been talking a little bit, and one of the things that people do is they use incorrect deductive reasoning, and
Yeah.
that can
Yeah.
really mess up an argumentation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad you yeah, I'm glad that we're starting the discussion here because you're right, Josh. There's a lot of ways in which you can form an argument, and it ends up being not a logical argument because you break the chain of logic along the way. And just as an example, let me give you an idea how you can start with something and have true premises to your argument, um, but end up somewhere that's not supported by those premises. I'm just going to use an example here. So, all goats eat grass. That would be a premise. And I could start an argument that all goats eat grass, with that one premise. And then maybe I could add another premise to it and say, I have a goat. And so that's a second premise. And you see where I'm going here. You might, we think this way regularly. We think, whenever we talk and communicate with each other, often we'll think in these terms. There'll be a therefore in there. Therefore, and you would expect me to say something like, my goat eats grass, because that would be related to my premises. But instead, what if I was to say to you, therefore, my goat loves steak? Oh, okay. Well, that's not really related to the premises in any way. And it may be true that my goat loves steak, but it may also not be true that my goat loves steak. That might not be a true statement at all. But either way, my premises did not support that conclusion. And that happens a lot. That's one way of poor deductive reasoning.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. And so, you have to be careful about your conclusions. You have to go back and look at your premises and see if that therefore matches with them. What's another example of poor deductive reasoning?
You're going where I was going. Yeah. So another example, you could have not just a premises that are true that don't support your conclusion. You could also have a false premise. If you start from a false premise, you might not end up at where you want to end up either, with a true conclusion. Let me give another example, just for the sake of our conversation and ease of understanding. All fish are red. Well, that's not true. But if I started there and then I said, Dory is a fish, therefore Dory is red. Of course, we all know Dory's not red. We know Dory is blue. But nonetheless, I made the argument based on a faulty premise. Now, my argument was sound. If all fish really are red and Dory is a fish, then Dory must be red. My argument, my logical reasoning is sound, but I started at the wrong spot. I started with a false premise.
Yeah, exactly. And so, when we're making arguments, and in particular, the idea of, again, the apologetics, making a defense, what we want to do then is to make sure that we're giving sound arguments with valid premises. So we want for everything to flow together, and we also need to check our premises and see if those are correct. And so, the idea of the cosmological argument is one that's been around for a very long time. It comes in a lot of different forms, but the one that I would like us to talk about today has two very straightforward premises and then a conclusion. And so the premise is that everything that begins has a cause. That's the first premise. So the second premise is that the universe began to exist. Well, if everything that begins has a cause and the universe did begin to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And so that is the specific deductive argument that we're taking a look at. And just so you know, those are going to be in the show notes. If you're wanting to take notes, you can write that down. And this level of argumentation and the use of deductive reasoning, a big influence for me has been William Lane Craig, and he makes some really good points about this, and both this argument and argumentation in general. He's someone I'll probably reference quite a bit as we go throughout these different podcasts. And I wanted to make sure to give him some credit for this discussion, because again, it's been a real big part of it. And some of the things that he said, is the value of using very specific arguments like this. And some of the things that I've seen as well is, first of all, you're going to have a very focused and specific discussion. If you're talking to someone who is an atheist, and you're talking about, well, here's what caused the universe, and they're like, well, no, here's what caused the universe, and now we just disagree. And so there's not really anywhere to go for that, because both things are vague. You may be able to argue about why, but you're not really talking about the premises that support either their argument or yours. And so by giving very specific premises with a very specific conclusion, you allow yourself to have a conversation. You allow yourself to ask, is premise one correct, that everything that begins has a cause? You allow yourself to ask, and the atheist to ask, the universe began to exist. Is that true or not? And then if they're both true, is it logically valid to say, therefore, the universe has a cause? And so, again, we have this very specific discussion, some very specific things that we're claiming, and that allows for a good debate. And I think that that's really important in our apologetics.
Hmm.
I also think it allows us to make an affirmative case. We're not just trying to tear down the different arguments for the beginning of the universe, or for, some people say that the universe has always existed. We're not just trying to tear those down. We're making a positive affirmative case for God with this argument. And so we're doing that, but again, we're giving sound and valid arguments all together, so that way they can be examined and dissected in a conversation. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and move on to these different premises and see whether or not they are true, whether or not there's a good reason to believe that these are accurate premises. So, as I mentioned earlier, our first premise is going to be everything that begins has a cause. So, Tim, what makes you think that this premise is true?
Yeah, Josh, what we're really talking about here is cause and effect. Um, we're familiar with that, right? We see that everywhere we look. We look at something and we see, okay, this is an effect. What caused it? We see an event and we say, well, what's the cause of that? And we put it into a linear chain in time. We think about there's a cause and then there's an effect of that cause. And that effect might actually end up being a cause of another effect. And that might, in fact, be a cause of another effect. And you've got this chain of causes and effects. And that's how we perceive reality. And I like to, when I'm teaching a Bible class, what I like to do when I'm talking about the cosmological argument, I do this for fun. I'll take a pin and I'll chuck it across the room in the class. And you might say, Tim, you really need to stop throwing things in church. And yes, I do. I understand this. But but I throw it across the room and then I say, how did that pin get over there? And everyone will look and say, well, you threw it there. And okay, so I was the cause of that effect. And so you can look at that and see an actual relationship between cause and effect. Well, when we talk about the cosmological argument, when we say that beginning, that first premise that everything that begins has a cause, well, that's true in what we experience in the material world and everything that we look at. Um, I'm someone who had a beginning. I had a cause. My parents were the cause of my beginning. My parents are some ones that had a beginning, and their parents were the cause of them. And it works with things other than life as well. We can talk about causality with formation of mountains and canyons and everything that we perceive in this material world seems to fit that basic premise. And so this is one of those arguments that we learn. We have evidence for it by experience, by what we experience. And so as we look at the world around us and how we experience it and we interpret it, we see that, yep, everything that begins has a cause.
Yeah, and I do think that that's really, ironically, the foundation of science. And
Mm-hmm.
so, the whole point of a science experiment, going to your idea of cause and effect. If I do this, then this should happen, and I try to get as few variables as possible, so I know exactly what the cause was, and each effect. And the idea of, as you go back, I remember seeing this in middle school. The idea of spontaneous generation. People would wonder where stuff was coming from in their milk, and so Louis Pasteur, learned the pasteurization process because they didn't just spontaneously generate; they had a beginning, and their environment and the chemicals involved and all of that allowed them to come into being. So there was a cause that was there. And actually, I think it's ironic because when you think about the idea of theory of evolution, so you've got all these animals, you have people, you have all these different examples, and the question is where did they come from? As Christians, we believe that God created them, but what you don't have is scientists saying, "Look, guys, the duck-billed platypus came from nothing." There's no way to explain this. It just came from nothing. No, the whole point of the theory of evolution is that everything that is now, that began to exist, it had a cause before it, and so they're trying to
Yeah.
trace that lineage all the way back. And
Yeah. It's
so,
built on that. Mm-hmm.
exactly. And
Mm-hmm.
so the idea that something could begin to exist without a cause really goes against our scientific principles, where we're continually searching for causes. If things did not need a cause, if things did not need a cause to begin to exist, then we don't really need to search or try to understand any of it, because all of a sudden something could just exist in my house tomorrow and it'd be great. But we understand that that's not how things work, and so I do think that, as you said, with what we experience, premise one is really self-explanatory, and something that we're all very familiar with.
And that really leads us to that second premise, which we mentioned, which is the universe began to exist. If we think about everything that we experience, um, it lends to the question: okay, well, the universe is all part of the things we experience. Did the universe begin to exist? Um, or did the universe, is it different than the rest of the things we experience on planet Earth? Is it somehow infinite? Is it something that's always been here? Is it just always present? And, um, we're just a one little piece of the universe that began to exist. And so the argument, the cosmological argument, says no, the universe itself actually began to exist. Um, Josh, you want to share? You and I have talked about this a little bit before about the difference between these two ideas, between the universe always existing and the universe beginning to exist. You want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you've shared with me about the universe? This idea of an infinite universe.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to ask for your patience, our listeners' patience here for just a minute, because I think there's some very good scientific arguments that go into the universe having a beginning, and we'll touch on those here in just a couple minutes. But I want us to start and kind of talk a little bit about a philosophical argument, and the idea here is around the concept of infinity. And I don't know about you, but for me, I've actually been intimidated about the idea of infinity, because a lot
Okay.
of times what I think about it is I think about it as this really big number. And so, when it comes to the idea of, well, is it possible that something would happen? Well, in an infinite number of possibilities, and I don't really think about that as being all numbers of all time. I really think of it being a very large number. And that's a very distinct difference. And so when we're talking about the idea of infinity, what we mean is something that is greater than any number. It's outside of numbers. You never actually get to it. And so, Tim, if you were to sit here and you were to start counting from one, and I said, all right, count to infinity. It doesn't matter how much time you have. Doesn't matter if you fall asleep, any of those things. You cannot get there. You cannot get to infinity when you are adding things one at a time. And that is an important distinction. When we're talking about sequence of events, that means that we're not talking about something infinite. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, we're asking whether or not the universe is eternal, right? That's kind of the big debate here. Did the universe have a beginning, or was it eternal? So if it's eternal, then that means it's been around for infinity. That means it's outside of actual numbers. But if you look at the idea of the universe being around for infinity, you can run into some very weird logical conclusions. It actually gets absurd at a point. So think about the idea of Saturn orbiting the sun. Now, let's say that someone was to make the argument that the universe as is right now has been happening for all eternity. So Saturn has been orbiting the sun. It's in the middle of an orbit. How many times has that happened, Tim?
Infinite times.
Infinite times. Okay. So you say that it's happened infinite times, but then once it makes its next rotation around the sun, it's infinite plus one. And if you keep going, you're now entering into these absurd situations because infinity is outside of numbers. So it's not possible for us to add something. And that goes back to the idea of, again, sometimes we think of infinity as a really big number. It doesn't matter what number you associate it. Once you add a number to it, it no longer is infinite. So even if it's been a million trillion or a million to the millionth power, I know computers now can run awfully big numbers. It doesn't matter how big the number is. Once you add one more to it, it's no longer infinite. Again, to show you about how crazy this is, um, Jupiter takes twice as long to go around as Saturn. So the universe has been around infinitely long. So how many times has Jupiter gone around?
Infinite.
But twice as many or half as
Twice as
many
many infinite times as the
as
infinite Saturn.
exactly. And so
I never thought about this.
yeah. So it becomes absolutely absurd to think about that happening an infinite amount of times. So
Yeah,
now
well, yeah.
So now,
Go
when
ahead.
you think about the concept of time in general, so now that we're going to have another second, another day, we can't look at the universe as being an infinite number of days backwards because we're going to add something to it, which means that it has an actual practical number. So it's not infinite. Um, and so we, again, this idea of time, it precludes the idea of there being an infinite amount. And so as we go through, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later in some of these uh, scientific arguments and some of the objections, one of the things that you see happening is, well, things are just happening over and over again since all beginning. But if we're in the middle of it and we're going to see the end of it and it's going to happen again, then we're adding one to infinity. And that's just not possible. That's not how infinity works. And so, again, I appreciate your patience and our audience's patience talking about this. There's a lot of good discussion on how infinity works, how it works with these discussions. But I do think it's important for us to take a step back and think about the absurdity. Again, the Jupiter and Saturn example just really to me highlights how absurd it is to think that the universe has been with us rotating around the sun for infinity. And I'm not saying that scientists argue that Saturn and Jupiter hasn't have been doing that, but it's just a good example of a concept of infinity being added to a series of numbers equaling infinity.
And to piggyback off of that, there's actually some scientific evidence that would argue against the concept of an infinite universe in the form that we just described. Back in 1929, a man by the name of Edwin Hubble, who loved to look through telescopes, he looked through the most powerful telescope of the time and was charting galaxies and the movement of galaxies. And what he noticed was something remarkable. And this has been really a whole shift in the way in which we as human beings perceive the universe ever since Edwin Hubble's time. But in 1929, he looked and he saw two galaxies were moving away from each other, which, if the universe always existed, then it would be somewhat stationary. There wouldn't be any sort of like expansion of the universe. But instead, what we see is that the universe was expanding, and they were moving in such a way as to indicate that at one point in time, the universe as we know it was not this size. In fact, it was, if you were to back up further in time, you would have found a single point at which the universe began to expand from. And this was a remarkable discovery because it indicated something scientific about the nature of our universe. The universe itself had a beginning point, at least if time was allowed to go back all the way far enough into the past, then we could make the observation from Hubble's discovery and from scientific discoveries since that there would have been a starting point, a beginning to the universe itself. This has often been used as evidence for what we popularly refer to today as the Big Bang, and that concept, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So I want to put pause on that. I want to get ahead of myself there with just mentioning that, but the conclusion of everything I'm saying here is that this second premise, there's scientific evidence that suggests this second premise is true. The universe had a beginning.
Yeah, and the idea of it moving, that's really powerful because, again, as you said, if you go backwards far enough, it gets together. But also, if you think about it from, again, the concept of infinity, it again gets ridiculous. Because if it's been moving outward infinitely long, then it would have reached any type of border that there could possibly ever be. Everything would be far apart. It would not be moving anymore because it's been doing this for more than a specific amount of time, more than any amount of time. So again, the fact that things are not stationary, the fact that things are not only have been moving but continue to move farther away from each other, I think really show that again we have a cause. There is a point in the beginning. Otherwise, we would be as far apart as we would need to be, and there'd be no need for movement. And the other thing that I think really comes into play is the second law of thermodynamics. And the point of that second law is basically that energy tends to find an equilibrium. So if you think about the example of getting your bath ready, so you put the water in the bath, and right at the spigot, let's say you're trying to make a nice hot bath, right there at the spigot, it's nice and hot. And as it goes out, it might be a little bit cooler. As long as energy keeps coming into your bath, that front part's going to be hot. But what happens as soon as you turn off the water? Well, then the heat dissipates throughout. You don't have one side of the bath that's really hot and the other side cold. The energy tends to move as far away as it can out. This happens, we see in liquids, but we also see it in gases as well. That again, we don't have you don't walk around your house and there's pockets of oxygen where all the oxygen is really concentrated. Again, it diffuses. The energy moves them separately, and so energy goes outward. And why this is so important is when energy cannot be created or destroyed. If energy is moving away from each other constantly, then at a certain point we're going to run out of energy. And so, you see that with the sun. We know that the sun is going to eventually run out of energy. It's not going to have its energy anymore. And that's true for the universe in general. It has this energy, but the energy is constantly being used. Now, if energy disappears over time and the universe is infinitely old, we would be out of energy already. But we know that we still have energy, and the energy has not dissipated infinitely far apart from each other. So that means that there was a starting point where the energy was condensed. Again, the Big Bang Theory, the
Mhm.
energy is the same as the objects of the universe. They all started at one point, and now they're moving apart. And so that energy death that we see coming makes sense because of the law of thermodynamics. And this is just about as established of a principle of science as there can be. And I think it shows our second premise, the idea that the universe did begin to exist. There is a specific point in time that it began.
Yeah. And so where does that leave us then? We've got everything that begins has a cause, and the universe began to exist. So then I think we're ready to pull into a conclusion, Josh. Don't you think so?
Yeah.
Yes, at that point, you have to relate these two. So, therefore, if everything that begins has a cause and the universe has a beginning, the universe itself had a cause, and that's powerful. To think about the universe had a cause. What could be so powerful as to cause the universe is the question that immediately pops to my mind as I think about, okay, what can cause a universe? Um, and and that's of course um, kind of the whole reason we're having this discussion as we're kind of gearing in this direction.
Yeah, it is exactly. And so you see that uh, this did have a beginning. Something caused it. And so I think it's only natural for us, and I think again, science shows that it's natural for us to ask
Mhm.
what caused this. That's what people are studying all the time. And I do think that, again, as we go through, we're going to look at um, could it be the God of the Bible that caused this? Is that accurate? Did he tell us that, and that's actually what happened? That's some things we're going to be looking at as we go further. But without a doubt, I feel very confident in this idea that the universe does have a cause. And while this is its own set of deductive reasoning, and I'm not going to lay out the full deductive argument that we did just here, I actually think that understanding that the universe has a cause tells us something about that cause too. Um, so the reason why I think that again comes from experience, but let's say you have a rock, on your porch. You can have that rock for years and years and years, and all it's probably going to get you is a stub toe. It's not going to create anything. It's not going to design anything. It's not going to do anything. And even if that rock had been around since infinity, the rock doesn't create. That's not what it does. It's an inanimate object. It doesn't have the ability to cause that type of change. But we understand that we go and mostly that's what we all do every day is we go and we create. We create meals, we create ideas, we create over and over again because we have the agency, we have the ability to make those type of decisions. And so, when thinking about the idea of what's outside of the universe that made this cause, well, I do think it's something that's infinite, something that's outside the idea of time and space because it's outside of our universe. But could that just be a rock? Well, if it was something like a rock, if it didn't have any agency, any ability to make a choice, then it seems to me that the universe probably would have never started to exist. Um, or it would have had to always exist because that infinite thing could not have made that change. So if the universe did not exist and something outside of the universe caused it to start, that must have been a choice that the cause made. And so that tells us a little bit about the agency and the personality of the cause. We'll talk a little bit more about if it gives us more answers than that. But I do think it's important to think about what the universe having a cause may mean about the cause. So, Tim, we've been talking here about the cosmological argument. We've looked at the deductive reasoning for it. And so, just to again make it concise, make it powerful, so we can talk about it with other people. But the first premise is that everything that begins has a cause. And so we see that when we look at our experience, when we look at the foundations of science, that yes, everything that begins has a cause. That's what we all know to be true. But then, too, in premise two, we talked about the universe itself. It began to exist, and so we come to the conclusion that therefore the universe has a cause. And really, I think the biggest place that the premise hangs is on the idea of, did the universe begin to exist? And I think there's a lot of good evidence for it. We talked a little bit philosophically, but we talked about a lot of scientific arguments as well. However, when we study with other people, and as we look at our studies of unbelievers, there are people who come up with objections. And so I wanted us to take a few moments to talk about some of those objections that we've run into. What are some of the ones that you've hit?
Yeah. Boy, I can think of a few objections actually that come up, Josh. But the one that seems to be like the first thing everybody wants to go to, and it's usually this gut reaction to jump to the end. They're almost like assuming a conclusion that we've made where we haven't even gotten to that point. But the jump to the end is, oh well, of course the universe had a cause. The Big Bang is the cause of the universe. Problem solved, answered. Okay, we're done. Let's walk away. We're finished. Um, and that seems to be the response that I've gotten a lot when I discuss anything about the cosmological argument. And the funny part is to that very response is that we never stop to just pause and think about it. Well, wait just a moment here. What caused the Big Bang? And if you really kind of pause there and think about that, the Big Bang itself, as we might think of it as a cause, like the cause of the universe, but it very well could be an effect of a prior cause. So then you have to ask, well, what caused the Big Bang? What caused the Big Bang to happen that caused the rest of the universe? And of course, we don't have the answers to that. If we're looking within our natural realm and everything that we've come to experience, but that the Big Bang theory is not actually the answer of what caused um, the universe, because then you kind of have to still keep going backwards from it.
Yeah, I think that when you look at that question, so the Big Bang Theory is the cause,
Yeah,
but
could be.
it's really, as you said, I think that it's accurate to say that it's the effect,
Hmm.
because what happened, what was before the Big Bang? If the Big Bang is a starting point, the Big Bang has a beginning. The Big Bang wasn't there from eternity. So if the Big Bang has a beginning, and everything that has a beginning has a cause, then what caused the Big Bang? And so
Hmm.
again, as we go back to this deductive reasoning that we've looked at, either it had a cause because it began, or the Big Bang was always there, which makes absolutely no sense. So I do
Right.
think that, as you said, stop, take a look at it, and then it really fits within this paradigm.
And and what I mean, you and I've had this conversation before, and one of the things you said to me is it's kind of a self-defeating argument, um, in some sense, and I think that does apply. So another way that people respond to this is to say, well, okay, well, we've got an answer. Um, it's not necessarily a big bang, but it's a series of big bangs. Uh, you've got a big bang that expands the universe, and it's like you described with the bathwater. You know, over time, the energy dissipates and it cools, and then eventually we get this cold universe. And when it becomes so cold that it can't, there's no energy anymore, it's going to, instead of expanding, going to start retracting and eventually come all the way back to the beginning again. But the power of the retraction creates the energy necessary to then explode again. And this is what's considered in science as the big crunch theory, that we've got this universe consistently doing this infinitely, um, forever. You want to talk about that one, Josh?
Yeah. So I actually was really excited whenever you mentioned this to me in our prep for this discussion, because there's a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of arguments that scientists come up with uh, to deny premise number two. Because I think what you see with this big crunch theory is exactly how powerful the cosmological argument is. Because if the universe has a beginning, well, then what does that mean? Well, that means it had a cause. Well, wait, what does that mean? Does that mean that there's something that we have to answer to, something outside of this universe? And and so you see that it really proves the power of the cosmological argument. And here's why. Yeah, I kind of started with my conclusion. Bear with me as we go through the rest of it. Because what they're saying is, you're right, the universe is expanding. And that indicates that there was some kind of starting point. You're right, energy is dissipating. And that means at some point it's going to dissipate completely. However, we're going to assume some cause that we haven't found is going to make it all retract. It's going to make all the energy become strong again, and then it's going to start the process all over again. And so they're not really arguing based off of something that they can test and see in science, but instead they're particularly with the big crunch theory, not all of them do this, but in particular with this one, they're acknowledging the scientific arguments that we put forth and saying that, yeah, there's some validity to that, but I'm going to resolve the problem by using these other things that really don't fit with what we observe. And so that makes it, again, I think, really powerful, the cosmological argument, because they're worried that premise two might be correct, that the universe began to exist. Um, Also, it's this argument and arguments like this why I think that philosophical argument that I brought up about infinity is so important, because how many times is it contracted? Infinite. So we're in the middle of one. So whenever the contraction ends and it goes through, then it's going to be infinite plus one. And so again, if you're saying that these repeatable cycled events are happening in a series, then I think you're dealing outside of infinity. So even if you were to find the scientific ideas behind the big crunch, there still needs to be a starting point for the very first one, because that idea of infinity, it happening infinity times, is absurd. And again, the flip side of that, not just how many times plus one, but also if it's happened an infinite amount of times, which means more than any numbers, then why are we in the middle of a process? Why aren't we at the end stage? Um, and so you can see the absurdity of something happening in succession, one at a time, an infinite number of times. And
Mhm.
so, again, that's why I was so excited about you talking about the big crunch, is because I think it shows us why the concept of understanding infinity is important. It shows us the scientific merit of the arguments that we brought up. Um, and also shows the power of the cosmological argument itself, that they really don't want premise 2 to be true. So, Tim, another objection that we ran into and talked about before we got on here was that sometimes people believe strongly in the cosmological argument, but they don't think that it really proves who Jesus is. And so, yeah, maybe there's a cause, but is that cause the God of the Bible? What would you say to somebody who's struggling with that?
Yeah, I think this is uh, for me. This is really powerful to think about the limitations of this argument. Um, Originally, if we look back in history and say, well, where did the cosmological argument come from? Who originally proposed this? And historically, we see that the argument was actually popularized not in Christian circles. It was popularized first around 1100 AD by a Muslim philosopher named um, Al Ghazali. And uh, at that time, the argument was used to show that Allah was the true God who was the creator of the universe. Um, and if you're not super acquainted with Christianity, you might say, well, what's the difference? Allah is God, and God is, the Christian God too. But there is a very big difference between Christianity and the belief system there, and the Muslim faith system. They're very different, and they're not equated. If you're familiar with Christianity, you know that the Christian God is not the same. And so the limitation of the cosmological argument is that it can be used to show the reasonable nature of believing in a supernatural deity that created or caused the universe to exist. But it can't be used, or at least I wouldn't use it by itself to argue that that creator is the God of the Bible. And that's why you've got a lot of people who are in the scientific community that accept these premises and this conclusion as true, and even accept the possibility of a supernatural realm out there where that could enact a cause on the universe to create the universe. But they take a perspective that is anti-Christian in that perspective, whether it be like a deist type of view, like, well, there's some sort of deity out there, but we don't know what it is. We have no idea. Or whether they take a different faith system. I think that's a limitation of the argument, but um, that doesn't mean the argument doesn't suggest that there's something more than just this universe.
Yeah, I agree, and really, you can even think about it from the Christian's perspective. So, sometimes people will make the joke, the Big Bang Theory. God said bang, and it happened, or something along those lines. But where do we see about the creation? Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, that's a part of the Jewish tradition as well. And so, just because we can show that there is a cause, now there's still more work to do. And
Yeah.
as we go further, we're going to talk about Jesus and obviously Christians, the idea of Christ. We're going to talk about more specific evidence. But as you said, this argument is powerful, and it's very important
Hmm.
for us. One, when studying with other people, also for bolstering our own faith, because if people can be blinded to the idea of a cause for the universe, then they're definitely not going to accept some guy walking around after he was already dead. Um,
Right.
and so, you can look at the evidence independently, and there's power in the evidence for the cosmological argument. There's power for the evidence for the resurrection, as we'll show later. But combining them makes them stronger, in my opinion, and again helps meet people where they are at. Some people
Hmm.
need to have this conversation to be able to even have the conversation about Jesus.
Yeah.
So I do think it's good for us to talk about, even though it's not in and of itself the end of the apologetics. It's not the end of the defense. We're going to keep on
Right.
defending in other arguments as well, and that's okay.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think about, we were talking about objections, right? And I as I think about objections, um, sometimes the objections themselves are not recognizing the purpose of the argument. Um, One of the objections that I often hear is, "Oh yeah, well if God created the universe, then who created God?" And that's the very popular. It's a popularist objection, but that's not really the purpose of the argument. And I don't want to get into like a theological discussion of, you know, infinite deities. Um, that's not where I want to go with this. Uh, but the argument itself is not meant to tell us who the creator was, or even I will admit it doesn't necessarily tell us there is a creator. What it tells us is there's something beyond this natural world, that this natural realm as we've come to know it, that must have enacted a will on this realm that caused this realm to exist. There must be a cause to the universe. That's what the argument is telling us. And I think I've seen people abuse the argument, take it too far, and I've seen people neglect the argument and ignore the argument. And that's unfortunate on both sides.
Yeah, and again, I think it's why it's so powerful for us to crystallize what it is that we're arguing, and why I wanted to use this particular deductive argument. Because when you talk about the idea of who made God or who caused God, what caused God, let's take it back. Well, you're not actually dealing with this argument. You're not dealing with our premise one, that everything that begins has a cause, or premise two, that the universe began to exist. What you're actually doing is you're making a whole nother deductive argument. Now you're saying premise one is everything that begins has a cause. Premise two is the cause, or God, began to exist. The cause of the universe, there is what I mean. The cause of the universe began to exist. And once you put that as the premise, well, now that's something for us to evaluate. That's something for us to ask
Mhm.
whether or not that's true.
Mhm.
And obviously, that's not what we're talking about on this podcast specifically. I do think that the cause of the universe has given us his will. He's told us about himself. And so, because of that, I think that I have an answer to premise two. But regardless, we're not talking about the same deductive reasoning anymore. We're now
Right.
entering another conversation that not only is the beginning of the universe, or how the universe is for all time, depending on how you look at premise two in our argument, but you're looking at something outside of our universe. And so we have to be real careful about assuming truth or falseness about a premise that's outside of our universe. And so if you're just going to say, well, then what caused God? That's a premise that needs to be explored and studied, not just casually thrown out. All right. Well, Tim, thank you for coming on and talking with me about this. I've really enjoyed the study, enjoyed our discussion about it, and it has been something that has helped strengthen my faith. And again, I thank all of you for listening. One of the things I mentioned when we talked about the big crunch theory is that there's a lot of very specific scientific examples out there that people try to throw out to invalidate premise two. And so, if there's something that someone has a specific question about, wants to talk about more in depth, I'm happy to do that on a case by case basis. But just for time's sake, we talked about it from the argument today. If you have something you want to bring in, you can contact us at theburningcoal.com/contact, and there you can ask that question, and we will try to make time in order to address it specifically. But again, I really appreciate everybody listening. We are going to be continuing this series and looking at more evidences both for the cause, but then also we'll be narrowing the conversation down to Jesus himself. I hope this lesson blesses you in your walk in his kingdom.